On the morning of August 1st, 1966, shots ring out from the observation deck of the clock tower on the University of Texas campus. It marks the infamous beginning of the modern era of mass shootings in America.
I'm Sarah Ferris, true crime podcaster.
And I'm Catherine Schweit, the former head of the FBI's active shooter program.
And you're listening to Stop the Killing. Welcome to this episode of Stop the Killing, which is actually our first one recorded back since Christmas. So I feel like we're a bit out of practice given it's February. But
do you reintroduce yourself? Because I don't really know who you are.
I don't know who I am right anymore either. Don't worry about that. Because I've been in New Zealand for 2 months. So
yeah, you sound different. It must be that accent.
I actually had to spell a word out for my English friends just the other night because I feel like I've slipped into my Kiwi accent too much. So we might need subtitles, which isn't great for the podcast. But now that we're back, straight away, I was straight back into the sort of firearms discussion and stopping the killing when I got back on terra firma in the UK. And one of the first things that popped up was a LinkedIn post from Stephen Keogh, who is joining us today. Hey. And Stephen is, we were just saying before we got on air that Stephen's one of the very few people that we've met in the flesh when we're interviewing because we actually met at CrimeCon drinks.
We did, yeah. Christmas drinks. A lovely way to meet.
It was. And I'd followed you on LinkedIn before that, so I know a lot about what you do. But I would love for you to introduce yourself to our audience and just tell them who Stephen Keogh is.
First off, it's Stephen Keogh. It's Irish. So it's a slight, like the Irish like to slip in consonants that have nothing to do with the sounding of the word. So that's what they've done with.
Wait, I have to tell you, my maiden name has consonants that no one pronounces. My maiden name is Scottish, and so it's Waugh, W-A-U-G-H.
Oh yeah,
I spent my whole life with people calling me Catherine Wagaha.
Yeah, I get it all the time. Keogh, all sorts. Yeah.
The reason I pronounce it that way is because I went to a school with a friend called Keogh, and that's how they pronounced it.
See, I used to get told off by my Irish nan for pronouncing it wrong because it's pronounced something that it's like I can't even do it properly because I'm not Irish. But Keogh. But if I was to say it out, I'd just sound like a weirdo, wouldn't I? So she was proper Irish. So
what a great start! I've offended you. You've offended the
I'm
Irish.
not offended.
Well done.
And I've disclosed I'm Scottish, so we all hate each other.
So I'm Steve Keogh. I was a police officer in London. I did 30 years before leaving in 21. It's been 2 years now, and that 2 years has flown by.
Wow, 2 years.
And yeah, so I spent the majority of my career as a detective, and I'd spent the last 12 years investigating murder. I did a few years terrorism, but the last 12 investigating murder. And I always feel it's a bit corny when I say this, but it's like I found my calling. As soon as I started investigating murders, there was nothing else I wanted to do. It was almost, for me, it was like the pinnacle of what I could do, to find the person that's committed the ultimate crime and get justice for it. And when I got my first conviction at court and the family come up and they give you a cuddle and they just say, thank you, I feel like we can move on now. And just that feeling of getting that justice for that family, to me was like, wow, I can't do anything else. And I didn't. And I stayed doing the rest of my career investigating murders. And then since I've left, that's all I ever talk about now is murders. That's why you would have seen my LinkedIn posts, Sarah. It's like everything I talk about is just murder. I've written 2 books. I've had 2 books published since then. I've got a TV show coming out in March. It's about murder. It's like everything.
Murder. I see a theme.
Yeah. But I mean,
can you tell us your books?
So the first one is called Murder Investigation Team, How Killers Are Really Caught, which basically looks at how in this country, so it's very specific to this country, how we investigate murders from the crime scene all the way through to court and the nuances around that. And then my next book was applying that same kind of thought process to the Jack the Ripper case. So it's a modern day look at Jack the Ripper. And then the TV show's called Secrets of a Murder Detective. And it's on True Crime, comes out. I don't know when this will come out, but this comes out, the TV show comes out on the 20th of March. And it's all a bit mad because I'd none of this planned. When I retired, I don't know about you, Catherine, when you left the FBI, what your mind map was. but mine certainly was not. Yeah, I have my own TV show.
Yeah,
So
it was none of this.
it's crazy, isn't it? You kind
I
of get
can guarantee.
dragged down a certain route, don't you?
Yeah, when I left the FBI, I was running the FBI's active shooter program, as our audience knows, and I had been assigned that, and it's all I did. I slept and ate, and it's like when you say when you're with a murder case, when you're going on trial, when you work your case, that's all you're doing. And when I left the FBI, I was just doing that, and I left thinking, okay, good, I never have to do that again. And now this is all I do. It's so sad.
Yeah. It's your niche, isn't it? And it's very difficult. It doesn't easily translate into the real world. I mean, I could have gone into some sort of corporate investigations, but it's not the same, is it? And so investigating murders, and when it's your expertise, it's like, well, where do I channel that? And there are a lot of people that are interested in it. So that's how I've ended up doing what I'm doing.
It's great insight. I haven't read your book, so I have to take a quick snag and get those. Because it's right up my alley.
Right. Yeah, I mean, you'd be interested because obviously you're very different. The way we do things in the UK is very different to how it's done in the States.
Perfect segue there, actually, Stephen, because obviously that is what caught my attention about a LinkedIn post that you put up. And I was wondering if you could give us just a little bit of an overview of that LinkedIn post. And for those people that aren't on LinkedIn and haven't seen it, what did it contain?
What I've done every year, it's called the ONS, the Office for National Statistics. They publish figures around crimes, and around February every year, they do it in relation to homicides. And so each year I look at the figures to see, what does it tell us? Are there any patterns? Is there anything interesting in the crimes that are being committed? And this particular post, I was looking at the use of firearms in murders. Now, in the UK, it's very low. So last year, the reporting year, so it ends in 31st of March 23. So for that year, in England and Wales, because it's only for England and Wales, Scotland are separate, Northern Ireland separate, we had 29 murders that involved firearms. And then
That's pretty close to us.
I just saw Catherine's face if you're not watching this on video. Give us the reaction behind that face, Catherine.
I didn't mean to interrupt you. I was just astonished.
Yeah.
Even though I knew the number, I was still astonished.
When you say it out loud. And then
Yes.
what they do is they break it down into whether that firearm is a registered legal firearm and the holder has a license for it, or if it's illegal. And in that period, there were 6 murders that involved a licensed firearm. They also include if they're not identified, but none were unidentified. So the other 22 were illegal firearms, meaning there was no license and had been brought into the country illegally. So yeah, they're pretty low. I mean, our murder rate mostly consists of knives. I think that counts for, off the top of my head, something like 70% of our murders relate to the use of a sharp instrument, a knife. So guns, when you compare it to the rest of the world, it's still a problem. We consider it a problem. For us, one murder with a gun is one too many. So obviously, we're not naive. You're never going to stop it. But the idea is we try and make it as difficult for people as possible to have access to firearms, essentially.
Before we came on air, you had a little bit of an insight of your experience of the UK gun culture or lack thereof. Can you tell us what it's like to work in the police force? How often you come in contact with guns in the UK?
Right. So for me, I can only talk for me personally, my experience. I did 30 years in the police. The only guns I ever came across were those that we took off of criminals, be they were arrested with them or left at a crime scene, etc. In my life, I've only ever fired a gun once, and that was clay pigeon shooting. So to me, guns are something that is on the telly mostly. It's like, do you know what I mean? It's not part of my life. I investigated some of the worst criminals in this country: terrorists, murderers, armed robbers, gang members, and I never ever felt that I needed a gun. There's not that culture. So if I'm going into a situation and I think there might be a firearm involved, then I've got the option of using, in a pre-planned operation, firearms officers. If I think someone's going to be violent, I can bring in officers that use like the riot shields and that kind of thing. But I would say 99% of the arrests that I made, it was just me and my colleagues going in. And I never felt in danger. I never felt like I was putting myself in danger. It's a very different culture. Like when we're arresting someone, even if they've committed a murder, I can only go by what I see on TV. And if we're talking about the States, I get to see like police officers getting killed, serving warrants and doing sort of some real mundane police work and getting killed for it. Whereas my colleagues know we were going into situations arresting some of the country's most violent criminals, but I never felt that there was that there wasn't a culture of them like, I'm going to get away at all costs. It was almost like they might put up a little fight occasionally, but nothing serious. They resign themselves to the fact they're going to get arrested, probably going to end up getting bail and coming out anyway, because most of the time when people get arrested for murder, a lot of the time it's on evidence that isn't going to get you across the threshold to get someone charged. They're going to have to be released. So there isn't that culture of, I'm going to get away at all costs. Obviously, occasionally a police officer does get seriously injured and on rare occasions they do get murdered. But I never ever felt in the situation, well, that could have gone completely wrong there. I never did. So personally, I'm pleased I didn't carry a firearm, and I wouldn't have wanted to.
Catherine, give us the other perspective of that, like from the US.
Well, I mean, there's so much to unpack there. Maybe I'd start with the fact that you had 29 homicides. Is that how many you said?
29 involving a firearm, yeah.
29 involving a firearm. Around the same time, our years don't duplicate exactly, but in roughly the same time, the United States had 20,000 homicides.
Perspective-wise per capita as well, I think it's important to say, obviously, that England...
How many people? Okay,
Wales,
somebody do the math on that.
For context, last year's 29 murders equate to 0.048 per 100,000 population.
Yeah.
The latest figures from the CDC in the US showed that in 2021, there were 20,958 murders involving a firearm, equating to 6.3 per 100,000 population. Okay, so there it is in black and white.
Yeah. It's quite a contrast, isn't it?
We have about 320 million people in the United States.
Yeah.
But 20,000 homicide victims with guns. And firearms accounts for about 80% of the causes of homicides. The tool used in a homicide. I mean, that number, I will say, has been climbing. So like 8 out of every 10 U.S. murders involves a firearm. And really, that number has climbed every year for the last couple of decades, right? I will say that to be complete in terms of the firearms use in the United States in so many other ways, that accounts for only about 40% of the deaths that happen in the United States, because 60% of the deaths involving a firearm are suicides. So that is the really horrible, silent torture that guns has brought the United States.
If you've got a gun, it's very quick and very easy, isn't it? And so many people are in situations where they're at the lowest point of their life. And we've probably all had at a point where you look back at your life and you think, I was really, that's the most down I've ever been. And all right, you might not have tried to take your life, but there are many people that it might flash through their mind. But in the UK, right, you've got to really make an effort. You've got to think, well, how am I going to do it? Whereas if you can just at that low point in your life, just reach down and get a gun and pull it to your head before you even had time to reconsider and think, well, actually, this isn't what I want to do. It's done. So you can see why, can't you?
Absolutely. That's an excellent point. When I talk to people about gun and gun availability, I think it's such a lost piece of information that if I said, everybody's going to keep cyanide tablets in their kitchen, and that was something you just normally kept all the time, and they were in the bathroom, in the kitchen, and they were so handy. And then you had someone who was dealing with some issues, whether it's health issues or emotional issues, mental wellness issues. And we know that for suicide, I'm no expert in that area, but often it's the momentary opportunity. I have a friend who picked up her partner's service weapon and killed herself. And it was while they were arguing. And it's only because the service weapon was on the table.
Yeah.
I mean, everybody involved was overwhelmed and devastated. And it was just devastating. And it's the opportunity. And if we kept other tools that were so swift, we would probably see those used in suicide too, right? But in the United States, guns are very available and people pick them up. And also they're unsecured. So many guns are unsecured. So you may be fine, but your spouse or partner or son or daughter is having troubles and decides to commit suicide, and they know how to find a gun so easily. They can just do it in their own home or in their backyard.
In the UK, we do have a lot of guns, but the controls are very strict. So what the government also do is they publish figures around how many people have firearms, how many firearm certificates have been issued. So there are actually 500,000 people in England and Wales that have a firearm certificate, and that would be either a shotgun or a firearms license. And firearms license generally is going to be a rifle, because handguns, essentially, there aren't any handguns in the UK that are going to be licensed. You might have some that have been adapted in a special way that they can be used in sports, for instance, target shooting, but even they are really strictly controlled. So having a gun license in the UK is a privilege, it's not a right. You have to prove that you're the sort of person that should be able to, first off, be in an emotional state, not have a criminal record, not have any allegations of violence, etc., against you. And then if you pass those barriers, then when you keep it, it has to be kept in a secure, locked cupboard. So what you were talking about there, Catherine, where you've got the children, the siblings, whatever it is, coming across a firearm and using it, that shouldn't happen in the UK if it's been looked after as it should be.
So here's a question for you, and I'm happy to talk about what's required in the United States. But when you say it has to be locked up and you have to have this license and there are so few handguns, or none, essentially, who monitors that? How do you have confidence? I say this because you're law enforcement, prior law enforcement. How do you have confidence that people are following that part of the law? You know, it's kind of like most people follow the seatbelt law. Most people might not follow the speeding rules.
Yeah. No, I get that completely.
I mean?
Yeah, I get that. Yeah. It's the police that issue the license and it's the police that monitor it. It doesn't always work. I mean, I've said there that there were 6 murders last year that involved a firearm. I don't know the details of those, but in my mind, I can think they're probably domestic related, that kind of thing. So if you've got a firearm, there is no 100% way you can say that this isn't going to be used in the wrong way. Or you can do your best. You can try and make it as stringent as possible, make it as difficult that it's not misused. That's all you can do. But it does go wrong sometimes. So for instance, we're 24 now, aren't we? So 3 years ago in Plymouth, which is a small town on the south coast of England, there was a man down there who had a licensed shotgun who went on a bit of a rampage and shot and killed 5 people. And this was with a licensed gun. And in actual fact, when you look back at our history, recent history of incidents of mass shootings, they're all licensed guns. None of them involve illegal firearms. So it's not perfect, and it can, and it almost certainly will go wrong again.
Just, for comparison, in the US, we have a completely different system, as you know, of gun ownership. You buy a gun, but there is no licensing involved. And now, where prior you didn't, in most instances, there's some way to have what we call an instant background check. The FBI manages our NICS system, our National Instant, background check system. We have stores that just sell guns. And those are all kinds of firearms, rifles, handguns, shotguns. And the stores have a little, monitor like you would have to run your credit card through. And it's connected to the FBI's NICS system. Plus, they also have systems in different states. We have 50 states. So of course, there's different systems in different states. But those are checks that just check to see if you're a prohibited person. So we're kind of the opposite in that we set the categories of when you can and cannot own a gun. And then after that, it's a free-for-all. Every time, Sarah steps in and she wants to buy a gun, she steps into a store and she fills out a little sheet with her basic information. They run it through the system to see if she is a prohibited person. And that might be because she has a prior felony, because she was dishonorably discharged from the military, because she has been adjudicated with a mental health condition or institutionalized against her will, certain categories of things, but only a handful of them. And if her background doesn't fit into one of those, then I don't know what your military experience is, Sarah, but if it doesn't fit into one, 0, she's holding a big 0 up, then you get the gun. and they have 3 days to run that background check. If the 3 days passes and the FBI hasn't been able to finish that, since they do so many background checks, you get the gun anyway. Unless you're under the age of 21, they'll give the FBI another 7 days to check records. So you get the gun. That's how we are. In the United States, anybody who owns a gun, more than half of them own more than one gun. And each time you just go in and get it. There's no licensing involved at all. No certification, no licensing, no training requirements, no interviews ahead of time. And every time you could just go in. So some people, I remember when I was doing research for my first book, I looked up, as much as I could find, what's the average number of guns gun owners own? And it was 17. 17 guns was the average number. I'm sure it's...
Why does that feel like?
That's crazy.
Yeah.
Why would you need 17 guns? I mean, I'm very much into my zombie films, so I'm thinking like for a zombie apocalypse, that could come in really handy. But for your everyday life, I can't really see where 17 guns can be used.
I think the translation is that in the States, we have developed a culture that is very different, particularly in the last 50 years, where gun ownership isn't considered something that's used. It's considered something that you have. Like I have a lot of necklaces and I use and wear them once in a while.
Right.
And gun ownership has become that for many people. I know people who, like some friends of mine who gave, each other rifles for their wedding anniversary. Now, you draw what you want from it, but they're divorced now. So just saying.
Yeah, I'd be thinking that'd be like getting a fry pan or a vacuum cleaner.
Well, they brought them out to show me how pretty they were.
Wow.
So it's such a different attitude. For me, as from law enforcement, guns are tools. Guns are tools. For a farmer, I would think a gun is a tool.
Yeah, I mean, that's technically what they need to be here. Right? It's either you're using it for farming, getting rid of vermin, or it's some sort of sports activity. You can't have a firearm for self-protection. That's not the criteria. Not in England and Wales. Not in England. Potentially, I think you can in Northern Ireland. That's a different thing altogether. But yeah, so you have to have a good reason to have it. And like I say, it's not a right, it's a privilege. And that's the way people have to look at it. I don't have a right to own a firearm. I have to prove to the police, I have to prove to the licensing issuers that I'm a capable person and I would look after it in the right way.
Well, and I'd be remiss if I didn't say here in the States, any gun owner would tell you that, not any gun owner, but most gun owners would tell you that it is a right, not a privilege. And because it's a privilege, because you view it that way, that's a different criteria, like getting a driver's license. But it's a right here, and they attach that to a couple of things. One is that our Constitution has amendments to it. One of them is the Second Amendment, as we know, as we've talked about before, which says in the most convoluted way you could possibly say that someone has a right to having a gun somewhere, because the Second Amendment refers to militia and being well armed. And the Second Amendment doesn't really say an individual has a right to a gun. It's been interpreted that way off and on. But in the last few years, we've done kind of an about face on where we had court decisions that said there is no right to an individual, right to a firearm for protection. Now the Supreme Court firmly has said there is an individual right to protection. So it's dramatically changed the authority, but not necessarily impacted the ownership. The ownership has always been there. And the questions have been, can I carry my gun while I'm walking to the movies and to the restaurant? My favorite part, just an aside, but my favorite part on social media is when you see somebody who's like in a line at a fast food restaurant and they take a picture of the person in front of them, and it's some guy all decked out in camo gear, and he has like a handgun on and another sidearm on, and he's got some long gun crooked over his shoulder. And the caption is always like, yes, it can be tough to get the right sandwich here. You got to make sure you're prepared.
In the UK, we've been on a journey, I think. Our laws are shaped by events around the firearm. So you used to be able to have a handgun. And in 1996, I think it was, is it 96? Yeah, 96 in Scotland, Dunblane. I don't know if you've spoken about this on your show before, but
We have.
that those 16 children that were killed there, that led directly to handguns basically not being allowed in the UK. And they had a system where the government bought them back to compensate people for handing them in. But like I say, that doesn't stop it. So the latest ones we've had have tended to be people going on rampages with shotguns. So it can still happen. For us, as a country, I don't think we feel restricted by these because we haven't got that culture of carrying guns. I mean, I come from a very working class background so I've got to be honest, when I was a kid, I remember one of my best friends, his dad had a gun in his bedroom. His dad was a bit of a criminal, and he used to show me his gun. He said, I have this revolver. So that was my first involvement with guns. But that was just the estate I grew up on. It was a bit dodgy. But most people's guns just don't form part of their life at all. They're not into sports. That's often it's a bit of a more of a middle class thing where they go out shooting in the country and stuff.
Because it's expensive. It's expensive to keep up that kind of sport. It's like owning and riding horses. There's a cost associated with actually using your gun for sport.
So when these more restrictive rules came in, nobody was up in arms about it because the vast majority of people didn't affect. I don't often shed tears, but when I do, it tends to be because it's children that have been hurt. And I did, when one of our national newspapers had the picture of those 16 children around the outside of it. And it literally brought me to tears just to see what had happened to them. And you just think there is no right that somebody has that trumps those children's right to life and the parents that have had I mean, I'm a parent. I can't even begin to imagine to have your child ripped out of your life like that. Nobody's right trumps those children's lives. And I think that's the attitude of the vast majority of people in the UK. So there was no resistance to the government coming in and say, well, actually, no, you can't have handguns.
You know, in the States, in December of 2012, we had 20 children killed at Sandy Hook Elementary School. And the president came on air shortly after that. And, you know, the president of the United States is usually a pretty stoic position, right? Those people have been through a lot. They deal with a lot of things. And he started talking and he had to actually wipe tears from his eyes. I think he was just overwhelmed with the trauma that the country was going through. And yet what happened is, I mean, we have a different political environment here, and the complexity of firearms manufacturers, their connection to firearms rights organizations, and that connection to politicians is different than I think in any other country. It's been this created solid block that has really created kind of an us versus them environment in the country and created a culture where you have to be on one side or the other. And so every time a shooting happened after that, where in other countries we saw just what you mentioned, where there were efforts when there was a shooting in Canada, New Zealand, Australia, there were efforts in the country to say, let's take these, you know, items out of circulation. In the United States, they became this standing my ground. I'm going to fortify and say, I have these rights. I have these rights. And the politicians would say, this isn't the time to talk about changes in the laws. And it's very interesting because the commentary behind it in the States is based on, I hear people say this all the time. It's so frightening because this is the thought process. I can't give up my guns because what if the government outweighs my rights? I have to be able to protect myself from the tyranny of the government. That's what our country was founded on, overthrowing another powerful government, England, who was taking away our rights or not giving us all our rights. So it's like a philosophical discussion that it's hard to have in present day because you want us to go back and say, but 20 murdered children and 6 murdered women.
What I find sort of interesting might be the wrong word, but around this is that all of the incidents that we've had maybe 4 high-profile mass shootings in the UK: Hungerford, Dunblane, Cumbria, and Plymouth. So we've had 4 incidents: 16 children and a teacher killed in Dunblane, 16 people killed in Hungerford. I think it was 5 killed in Plymouth and 10 killed in Cumbria. So that's over the course of the last 30 years or so. So still relatively small numbers. Every single one of those were licensed firearms. And we do have a problem with unlicensed firearms in the UK, but it's not those guns that are used in these mass shootings. They tend to be gang members that are using them within their own circle of criminality, using criminal against criminal. Interestingly, recently, just before Christmas in the UK, there was a 28-year-old man in Scotland who had ordered a gun from the United States on the dark web. And US law officials out there had intercepted it in the post, X-rays, however they do it, tipped off the authorities here, and they did what we called a controlled delivery. So they delivered the parcel minus it was a Glock 17 and 100 rounds of ammunition. So they delivered the parcel that it was in minus the gun and the ammunition. He accepted it, signed for it, gets arrested. And then they do a search on his phone or his computer. And he had been researching or doing Google searches around Dunblane and when the schools break up in Glasgow. I mean, that's quite frightening. Yeah. So potentially there, could you have had another Dunblane situation? I say it's luck. It is luck, but it's also down to the work the Americans did in intercepting the firearm. But you just feel that it feels like there's something going to happen again at some point, and that's the scary thing.
Well, I think we do live in a much more homogenous world. And, we export more guns than we're big manufacturers of weapons. And what we find is that there are shootings that happen in other parts of the world where they reference in their paperwork shooters from the United States and vice versa. There have been some unfortunate situations elsewhere where we look at the writings from our shooters and find out that they want to emulate them, right? They want to do the same thing, or they want to use the same weapon, or they want to dress the same way. So the internet has allowed that homogenation of all of the shooters. But you mentioned before about the type of guns and getting the guns. We know that criminals can get guns, and I think that's always said. Criminals can get guns. Well, it's harder to get a gun illegally than it is to go into a store. In the United States, you go into stores in every state and walk in and buy a gun. And we've had some shootings where, he's 18 and goes in and buys a rifle. The next week he buys another rifle. The next week he goes and does a school shooting. And that's part of what prompted the change in the laws last year to give us the time to do the background check on somebody who's under the age of 21. But they still get the guns. And when you talk about what guns are used in these major shootings that happen in the United States, the ones that are similar to what you just discussed in the UK and around Europe, those are often rifles because of the volume of rounds that they can fire. But those are very small in numbers. The majority of killings in the United States with firearms are by handguns. And even as you mentioned, the rifles that are used in the more news-covered shootings, they're legally purchased either by that individual or by somebody in their family or somebody they know. Very rarely is it just a straight-up illegal gun that's used. So it was legitimately purchased by someone and then borrowed or something. But the majority of firearms deaths in the United States, vast majority, are by handgun. And even the vast majority of what researchers who are searching like mass shootings, meaning 3 or 4 more people are killed in a shooting, still handguns. So handguns are absolutely the highest risk. Of the 20,000 people, 80% of them are men who are killed, which really translates into, losers shooting losers, shitheads fighting shitheads, gang members fighting gang members. And we saw that just a couple weeks ago after our American football championship. The Kansas City Chiefs won, and they had a parade downtown. And at the end of the parade, 2 guys who didn't know each other got into some scuffle, and both of them pulled out guns they had and started firing at each other. It caused this massive panic. There were people injured, and it was just 2 people who had guns with them because so many people feel this need to walk around with a gun and feel like a gun is the only solution to every conflict.
We do have a culture of that in some circles in the UK. So our gang members, especially in London, they do have access to firearms. Most of our firearms come from Eastern Europe. we've got strict rules here in deactivating a firearm. And if a firearm is deactivated in the UK, a proper job is done. Whereas in Eastern Europe, it can be as simple as just putting like a bolt in the barrel, which is obviously very easy. So what they do is they reactivate them, or they adapt blank firing. So that's where the majority of our firearms are coming from. They're coming from Europe, and they're going to gang members. So, for instance, I dealt with a murder where it was two rival gangs, and it was just a birthday party. I think it was like a 30th birthday party. One gang turned up to this house or flat where this party was happening, walked in, almost immediately saw their opposition gang, pulled out a gun. This fella pulled out a gun, fired a shot and missed, and two people inside fired back at him, and he got killed himself, even though he was the one that pulled the gun. So this was just a party, a 30th birthday party, where they released 3 firearms. And we also found a silencer as well. So we do have a problem with guns. But to me, you know this much better than I do, Catherine. There's a huge difference between those people that are going to take the firearms and go and do those mass shootings, and these gang members that are carrying them as almost part of their everyday. Theirs is for protection and to enforce their drug dealing and their robberies, etc. There's a difference in the mentality of the people that are carrying the guns.
Yeah, and I think that the challenge that we're seeing now, the things that disturb me are, okay, bad guys carry guns and their buddies carry guns, and they're worried about people who carry guns, just what you were discussing. And then there certainly are people who go out and buy a rifle and try to shoot something up. And even though it seems like there's one of those in the news every day here, that's really not as common as it seems, much more common, albeit, than it is in your country. But the in-between people, that's the other part that it's like what creeps into that is I work with a lot of schools. You know, we have school principals and counselors and bus drivers and teachers are taking handguns out of elementary school backpacks because kids brought the gun to school because they were afraid and they thought maybe they would need it. And that's the
exact
scary
culture we've got with knives. That's the exact problem we have with knives. So
interesting.
People are carrying knives. So I posted about this on LinkedIn as well. I've got real strong feelings around this because I think what we're doing in the UK when it comes to knives is the people that are in charge just don't understand the problem, and they think that you can arrest your way out of a problem by criminalizing the people that carry knives. Yes, that they shouldn't be carrying a knife, but they're carrying a knife because they feel it's wrongly. They feel that they're safer carrying a knife. Statistically, you carry a knife, you've got more chance of getting stabbed than if you don't. But in their mind and where they live, they feel that they need to carry a knife because if they leave their front door, they're entering an area where other people have got knives. So what you're saying, it really resonates with me, but with knives and not with guns. And obviously, knives are much harder to control because everybody's got them in their house. So we have that same problem in probably amongst the same types of people, but just with a different weapon.
The thing with knives is it's accessible to everyone in their houses in the UK. But the same can be said, as you say, Catherine, with the amount of guns that are in people's houses. So accessibility to whatever weapon it is seems to be the issue. And
also as well, one of the fears we've got in this country is around terrorism. And it like that, you know, like the Mumbai style terrorist attack with a roaming gunman.
A roaming gunman in a mall. That's what that is.
Exactly. Yeah.
In case somebody doesn't know. And it turned into this long siege.
It was terrible. Well, and that's what we fear here. And we're set up to deal with that. But the reality of the last few terrorist attacks we've had is it's been people with knives. And how do you stop that? So, we're lucky in a way because we're an island. It makes it's obviously not impossible to get guns in because we have a problem with guns, but it makes it harder. So that's why you would say the majority of your murders are involved in handguns, as are too. And I think that has a lot to do with it's much easier to smuggle a handgun into the country than it would be a rifle because obviously the size, trying to mask a rifle is going to be difficult. And if you're a gang member and you're carrying around guns, most of our murders are spontaneous. They're not like, I'm sure we have hitmen. I'm doing bunny ears for people, aren't they? But we have people that take money to do, but not in a very organised way. It'll probably be for a couple of £1,000. It'll be one gang member bumping off another gang member or something. So the majority of our shootings tend to be spontaneous. A lot of it is to do with if you're in the wrong area at the time or there's a dispute over drugs and they see you. It's spontaneous. So that's why it's handguns, because they're easy to conceal. Sawn-off shotguns as well, less so, but we have a problem with them. But rifles, no. We've seen a few submachine guns, Scorpion submachine guns. We have a few of those. But rifles, not so much, because you can't wander around with them.
Yeah, here's a question for you. This is one of the things that we're dealing with, and I would say we, for at least 15 years, maybe 20 in the United States, we have been dealing with the rise of ghost guns, which we've talked about before here, but how a gun is registered in the United States. If it's considered a gun and so it can be regulated in any way, it has to have certain parts, and including the part that you would think of as the base of it that has the serial number on it, for those of you who are less gun knowledgeable. So you have the ability in the United States and elsewhere to order the parts separately and piece them together. Yeah. And then that is a problem so it's not registered, it's not licensed. They're in the process of trying to bring those under the control of government, licensing regulations in terms of sales. But that is a problem that we have primarily in the criminal world, of course. We're not seeing a ghost gun, which are relatively, I think it's fair to say, kind of unstable. We're not seeing those in terms of these mass shootings or active shooters. But it is a part of the firearm problem here.
In the UK, it's illegal to possess component parts. So whatever makes up the gun is illegal, including like a silencer would be illegal. So yeah, there's very strict rules. I mean, obviously, one of the issues we've got in the UK, probably everywhere now, is the 3D printers. That's something that is probably going to become more and more apparent.
Yeah. And I wonder, can you share how many law enforcement you have and how many carry guns? I mean, roughly.
Right. So I can only go by the Met in London where I work. I think it's about 33,000. And I think it's something like less than 10%, but that would include so a lot of our firearms officers are sort of diplomatic protection. So they would be on the Houses of Parliament, on the American Embassy, on places like that, static points. So a lot of our officers have got those firearms. We have what's known as ARVs, so armed response vehicles, that patrol, and there will be a number of them patrolling in London, and they will have armed officers that we can call upon. Then we have, for instance, we will have special firearms officers who are just there to respond to terrorist events. We have some surveillance officers that carry firearms. So there's lots of different departments would make up that 10%, but the vast majority of police officers that are on the street, they don't have a gun and won't ever have a gun.
So in the United States, obviously we're bigger, but in the United States, we have about 800,000 law enforcement officers. And being a law enforcement officer in the United States means that you are also trained and carry a gun. So otherwise, you're not a law enforcement officer. You're a different level of security. The terminology here is if you're law enforcement, you carry a gun. And I think that surprises probably people in the States who haven't traveled over the pond and seen that conflict is resolved with words.
Yeah. I spent 30 years in the police and I got assaulted once. So it was a fight at an engagement party or something. My colleague and I turned up.
That wedding turned out well.
Well, yeah, exactly. There were about 30, 40 people fighting. Two of us turn up and we calm it down. My biggest weapon were my words, because we call it policing by consent. So I can't impose my will and force on somebody. I have to get them on side. And you do that by your words, your gestures, your non-verbals. And I calmed it all down. And then some officers turned up and one of them had a bit of a big mouth, wound everybody up again. And instead of fighting each other, they all turned on us and I got assaulted. So I got assaulted because somebody else didn't know how to talk to people. But throughout the rest of my career, as I say, I arrested hundreds of people, murderers, terrorists, the lot. And nobody ever wanted to hit me because you deal with them in a certain way. Because you haven't got that firearm, you're not imposing your will on them. You're getting them to consent to being arrested, essentially. Obviously, not all of them. Sometimes you end up having to restrain them, etc. But I think that must definitely alter how you police. I mean, I don't like it when I'm abroad and I see police officers going. It makes me feel nervous. It's like I'm not used to seeing guns. So you might see them at the airport, at Heathrow Airport, for instance. You get armed officers there and stuff. And even when I see that, I never feel comfortable. Even in a police canteen, if the armed officers are there, you're always conscious of the fact there's a gun there. It's not something that sits well with you.
I don't know. I mean, it's everywhere here for law enforcement, so it's not a surprise. Although when I worked in FBI headquarters, every once in a while, the non-agents who didn't carry weapons, obviously, the non-agents would complain. Like if you go into the ladies' room and you'd set your gun down on the floor and they'd say, hey, because it's trickier for women who carry guns. And you'd set your gun down on the floor or on the counter or something. And they'd say, there was a woman in there and she put her gun down. But it's definitely seen here, and especially in the last decade, there's been much more of a concept of, I'm going to show you I have a gun. And what's happened is we've had people buy guns who've never touched them before. You don't even have to fire a gun to buy one in the United States. No training at all on how to load it, how to make sure that it doesn't discharge accidentally. No firearm safety training, like always point the muzzle in a safe place. Just none of that. You can buy a crossbody holster and walk out of the store with it with a handgun, with no one ever telling you that when you draw that gun from, your body, you're going to cross your arms. And if you discharge the gun early, you're going to shoot your own arm. Nobody tells you that.
Yeah.
It's so different than elsewhere.
Going back to the law enforcement point, since I've retired from the police and I've been on LinkedIn, I've got a lot of law enforcement connections in the States. And I've become aware of the number of law enforcement officers that are murdered. And it feels like, it might not be, but it feels like almost every day I'm seeing a police officer shot. It was some FBI agents, I think, last year. And
FBI agents who were executing a warrant on a child pornography case.
Sorry.
Like two people you would never think. They walked up to the door and they were killed. And they were killed in ambush. The shooter was above them.
Ironically, one of the last murders I investigated was a murder of a police officer who was shot. And this was somebody who, because there is a loophole in the UK where you can buy an antique firearm. There's no definition yet exactly of what is antique. So he'd bought an antique firearm off the internet and then made some ammunition to work within the gun. And he was a strange fellow, put it that way. And he was just carrying it around with him, got stopped by police and searched at night. And he had a holster under his arm and he missed the gun. And then when he got brought into the custody suite, he was handcuffed to his back, but he managed to reach round to the gun and fired it and killed the sergeant that was booking him in. So
that's terrible.
Yeah, but that's really thankfully rare. I went over to Illinois. I did a talk for the Homicide Association out there at their conference. And I was talking about the amount of officers that were murdered in the UK. And I think over the last, I can't remember it now because it was a year or two ago, but over the last 10 years, I think something like 10 officers have lost their life in the line of duty. Most of that tends to be around traffic accidents. And in that 1 year, I think the FBI had reported, I can't remember the exact figure, it's something like 250 law enforcement officers in America in that year. And if you think that's on year, it's, to me, that's why I don't feel, I look back and think I was in more danger for not having a gun. I think I was in, statistically, clearly less danger than a law enforcement officer in the States.
Let me ask you this. If you were going back and choosing your career path again, and if it was America that you were brought up in, would that have changed your choice to become a police officer?
Do you know, Sarah, that's a really good question. It is something that when I was in the States that I did think about. And the honest answer is it probably could have done. Because I've got so much respect for those law enforcement officers in the US, because you're making a conscious decision that you're going into a profession where there's a good chance that someone's going to want to kill you. And we don't have that here. All right, you can't be naive to the fact that it can happen. I've got 2 children in the police. My son and my daughter are both police officers. My partner, she's a police officer. My sister's a police officer. So a real law enforcement family. And I don't worry for them. I don't feel that they're going to go to work and I'm saying goodbye to them and they're not going to come home. It doesn't even enter my head. Whereas that must enter your mind as a law enforcement officer in the States, just by those sheer numbers and the fact that, as you say, Catherine, you could be doing the most mundane task and you could lose your life.
I think that's the challenge. The National Law Enforcement Memorial is across the street from our Washington field office that I used to work in. And they have a ceremony every year to add a name. They add the names, they etch them into the stones there. And the numbers, I'm not sure what year and what numbers you were catching at that time, but there's always, 50 law enforcement officers killed by firearms every year, or 60 killed every year. And, one is too many. But
this included where they were rammed off a road by a car and all that sort of, so it wasn't just firearms.
Okay, yeah, so that makes sense. The firearms are probably account for, a portion of those for sure, and the biggest portion perhaps. But there are law enforcement officers who are killed on highways all the time, run over by people and hit, assaulting an officer to kill him to get away, or people who are just drunk or not thinking and things like that. But the firearms, I think it is something that it's never not present. I go to arrest a bank robber. I assume they have a gun. So that's just kind of a strange thing that, I had never thought about that when I got into law enforcement, like you were saying, Sarah. The idea that people were just going to take pot shots at me because I, carried a badge.
Steve, it's been such a pleasure. Do you just want to tell all of our lovely listeners where they can find everything?
So everything is on my website, which is murderacademy.com. All my social links there. And murderacademy.com.
It's brilliant. Thanks so much, Steve.
It's been an absolute pleasure. See you at CrimeCon.
You bet.
Yeah.
Thanks for listening. And if you want to know more, Catherine's book, Stop the Killing, is out now. For more details, go to catherineschweit.com. Please consider also supporting our independently made podcast. It's simple to do. Go to patreon.com/Stop the Killing. And for as little as the price of a latte a month, you can be part of the solution to stop the killing. Patreon rewards range from official do-gooder status to ad-free episodes, autographed books, and opportunities to connect with us directly for your business, school, church, or even just a book club chat. But just knowing that you are part of a movement that has the power to make your community safer, well, that's got to taste better than a skinny cappuccino any day. So please head to patreon.com/Stop the Killing now and polish off your do-gooder halo, and make sure to include your name so we can give you a shout out. This podcast is a Community podcast production. That's Con with an N. If you want more content, then head over to Community Podcast at Instagram, where you'll find trailers on more binge-worthy true crime, like the award-winning podcast Conning the Con. And check out our show notes for all the links mentioned. Finally, if you want one takeaway action that you can do right now that can help make our community safer, please share, rate and review this podcast wherever you listen. Everybody needs to know that they hold the keys to see something and say something. Together, we can stop the killing.
It's one of those things you hope never happens, but you better train for it, because it will happen, and it will happen in places you wouldn't expect. Be ready for it.